Good afternoon, everyone. I'm actually so much more comfortable with being cussed. Friends, fellow Jamaicans, all protocols observed. I'm usually not lost for words, but it's hard for me to express my thanks to the Norman Washington Manley Foundation for this stellar award. The news regarding which was delivered by your chairman under the old lignum vitae tree at my house, COVID requirements were observed. I assure you I've not always felt appreciated, so being here is truly special to me. I had a tough time deciding what to say this afternoon. I could give you my environmental crisis stump speech about the state of forests and rivers and the atmosphere, and certainly send you home thoroughly depressed. Or should I speak about how it started for me, a little of which you've already heard, or look back at my 30 years as an environmental activist? Or should I delve into what it means to be from a place, rooted in a place? Since I couldn't decide, you're getting what I believe is called a wide-ranging address. But what you're not going to get is a laundry list of solutions, because I've become wary of listing these, since for me it seems clear that the problems stare us to the solutions. If we're polluting rivers, cutting down standing forests, we should just stop. Beginnings then, you've already heard that my environmental journey started on the Palisados Strip, where I had been taken by my own parents in childhood to enjoy the simple pleasures of that time. What the citation didn't say was is the thoughts in my head when I confronted this pile of garbage on the strip. It was not just litter, it was construction waste as well. And I thought, how could anybody drive a truck onto this beach and tip out its contents? How could someone move to go there at all, perhaps with a lover or a family for a picnic of sorts, in some way appreciating the surf and the spray and the curve of the land and the Plum Point lighthouse in the distance and the setting sun? How could they leave their chicken boxes and styrofoam plates and glass bottles right there on the beach? And yes, I thought somebody should do something. A little bit about Palisados. It was a narrow strip of sandy hummocks holding Kingston Harbor in loose embrace. The geologists and geographers call it a tombola, which is a sand or gravel bar that connects an island to another island or to the mainland. And as you all know, the historic town of Port Royal is at the end of the spit, and the Norman Manley International Airport about 1/3 of the way down. Maybe you don't know that it's old, about 4,000 years. Port Royal was once an island among a group of small sandy keys until early coastal engineers added wooden palisades to the keys, hence the name, Palisados, to trap the sand of the longshore drift, and the islands became joined together. Always part land, part sea, Palisados came and went over millennia, nourished by sediment from the Hope and Cane rivers further up the coast, torn away by storms, rent by earthquakes, ever in motion. Sand dunes grew and vegetation took hold. Hurricanes breached it, returning Port Royal to its island status twice in the 1700s. And in the 1930s, the native vegetation, which by then was well established, was removed, and 20,000 coconut trees were planted by prisoners. All died. And there's still a monument to this on the Palisados. Look for it next time you go out there. In the 1950s, following Hurricane Charlie, which devastated Jamaica in 1951, a groin field was built to defend the narrowest part of the spit. For nearly 60 years, my lifetime, the groins, a bit shorter than my lifetime, the groins protected a thin part of the Palisados. Men fished from them. The Palisados Road was built, widened. The airport was constructed, and the road led through sand dunes and cacti to the wetlands to the by then quiet fishing town of Port Royal. It is, perhaps was, a natural place right on the doorstep of the city of Kingston, there for all of us to enjoy. So the Palisados became a symbol for me as well as an actual place that I loved, because it tells an old story of how land is built by rivers and the sea, by weather, and by the restless earth itself, as well as the more recent narrative of how a rocky, salt-scorched place is colonized by plants evolved to live in harsh environments, and how despite its apparent barrenness, It is still a place where tiny hollows in driftwood or rocks condense fresh water for birds and insects, a place where marine turtles still come to lay their eggs. Of course, you have to be interested in that kind of narrative to see the way it is written upon and within the landscape. You can also visit the Palisados and see nothing of this. You can think only that the road needs to be wider because the sea is too close, that it needs to be developed. As the National Works Agency officer memorably put it on the occasion of turning about 1/3 of it into a pile of rocks, torn from some other part of the island, nature needs to be saved from itself. And that is how too many of us regard our land, as having no value beyond what it grants to us, we careless human beings. We have no interest in the land's story or in the lives of its non-human inhabitants. After the discovery that the Palisados had become a garbage dump, I started to read about the environment, which I have come to regard as an inexact term, a distancing description of what is no more or less than our one and only home. The more I read, the more concerned I became, and at the time the environment was not on the national agenda. Then in about 1990, I saw a story on pollution in Kingston Harbour written by one Dr. Omera Silva, on secondment from the Pan American Health Organization to the Ministry of Health, and I went to meet with him. After we talked, I asked if he would take me in the field, so to speak, although his field was garbage dumps and sewage plants. That became my field too. I took a day's leave from my insurance job and went with him to visit places I, as a lifelong Kingstonian, had never seen, had never even thought about. The 3 Kingston sewage plants in various stages of dysfunction, and the Riverton city dump. The Harbourview sewage treatment plant on the sea at the eastern end of the Palisado Strip was first. I stood on the beach looking at pools of raw sewage and the remains of a wrecked outfall pipe in the breakers of Big Sea. Untreated sewage flowed from the derelict plant onto the beach over algae-covered rocks into the sea. The site was bush and garbage, including used condoms and sanitary napkins. And there were families living under tarpaulins fastened to the old clarifiers. Land, sea, and people were fouled, degraded, and all I could think was, in what universe is this okay? We then went to the Western and Greenwich sewage plants, also in states of disrepair and inadequacy for the city, and then to Riverton. In 1990, when I first visited, I'd given no thought to where the bag of garbage I put at my gate ended up. It was a profound shock to confront Riverton's mound of stinking waste, being combed through by hundreds of people, including children. I stood there in my uptown clothes and sun hat and tried not to wrinkle my nose at the smell of rotting meat and excrement and burning. I watched a boy in torn-up underpants wade into the scummy grey water of the Johanny River. He waved to me, and I took a photo of him, this child in polluted water, which would have made me instantly and seriously ill. His hands raised as if in celebration, and I used a blown-up version of that photo in my environmental talks, my We Must Do Something talks, which lay ahead. Dr. Silva took slide images of that day, and I invited friends and business colleagues to look at them, and we decided to form an environmental group. We weren't sure what we were going to do or what to call it, but we settled on the Jamaica Environment Trust, which had a snappy, although somewhat ungreen, acronym, JET. And I want to recognize those first 7 founder members, one of whom, my sister, Susie, is still on the JET board and here with me today. So I'm often asked, you saw some shocking things and you were upset by them, but what made you think you could act? I believe this is a mixture of personal attributes, a bias to action, because for me, acting is an antidote to despair, a tendency both to naivety and to outrage. But also it happened because after that field trip day, Dr. Silva said to me, Diana, Jamaica needs people like you. Now, this had never occurred to me. I had received and internalized the not Jamaican message sent to anyone who looks and speaks like me. And I knew I needed Jamaica, but I had never imagined that it could need me. So sometimes what I want to say is that one person's words can throw locked doors open wide for another. Dr. Silva died a few years ago, but I want to acknowledge and express gratitude for the way he changed my life. So JET was formed. What can I say about those 28 years of nonprofit life? I left my comfortable private sector job in 1998 and began the struggle to keep JET's doors opened and the phone answered, writing grant proposals, delivering projects, some with success, some without. The many, many people I worked with over the years, young and old. I wish I could talk about all of them now, but that would be a politician-length speech. Let me just say there were many who came before me who sounded warnings about the wanton damage we were doing, many who stood with me on filthy beaches and garbage dumps, in courtrooms and classrooms, even in the corridors of power, many who dried my tears, soothed my anger, told me not to give up, and I thank them all. In the early days, our board members were mostly young parents, and we decided that education was vital, as you've heard, and that people would only seem to protect what they understood. We began doing our education programs in schools, and I learned that environmental education, perhaps all education, is a necessary but insufficient condition for change. I think of it as foundational, but it is not the walls and roof of a structure that can deliver attitudinal or behavioral change. Education in schools has to be repeated year after year because every year there's a new cohort of children, wave after wave. And environmental problems were not created overnight. They arise over the long term and can only be fixed in the long term. Yet, JET School's environment program, which you've heard was once in a third of our schools, was always difficult to keep financed and is now without funding. One thing I took from my private sector life into the nonprofit sector was a determination to build a full-time cadre of staff members properly compensated with paid leave and other benefits. A desirable job, in other words. And we did that, more or less, although sometimes it came at a personal financial sacrifice from me. But again, this system, and yes, nonprofit life has a system too, pushes back against that model, and it is incredibly difficult to meet a payroll to cover so-called core costs. I cannot tell you how many times I heard that funding was approved to deliver teacher workshops, plant trees, provide experiences in nature for inner city children, but with no funding provided for staffing. So if we value the work done by civil society groups, we have to be prepared to fund the people who do the work, or all the good people who are moved to join that sector burn out and leave after a few years. After about 10 years of leading JET, I was frustrated. I had written possibly hundreds of letters, sat on dozens of committees, written numerous grant proposals, attended countless meetings, and yet I still witnessed natural resource after natural resource fall. It used to be said about me, oh, her heart's in the right place, but she has no training. That's when they weren't saying, oh, she's just a jumped-up secretary. I had never left Jamaica for any length of time, and I applied for and received a Hubert Humphrey Fellowship to spend an academic year at a U.S. university, the University of Washington in Seattle, as it turned out. I hoped to get some environmental qualifications, but there I discovered I was not a natural scientist because my interests were too broad. So I ended up studying public administration and environmental policy. And I learned about the early days of the U.S. environmental movement, their use of litigation to bring about change. And after 2 years, I returned home with a new determination to file environmental legal cases to build environmental jurisprudence in Jamaica. That is a step that took me and JET into advocacy and activism. The latter being something of a critical term in the Jamaican context, not merely meaning someone who talks and acts, but colored with the taint of political activism. Activist too often connotes troublemaker. And that's something I want to pause on, the need for us to encourage and celebrate citizen activism. I mean, what? Do we want people who are not active, who do not speak up for what they believe in, who are too afraid of the real threat of victimization and therefore lapse into silence? Do we not want the engagement of our people, people who, to quote the late American Congressman John Lewis, stir up good trouble? I came home and Jet filed our first public interest legal case, along with another NGO, the Northern Jamaica Conservation Association, and 4 individuals from the Runaway Bay area, argued pro bono by Queen's Counsel Dennis Morrison. The case concerned the hotel that was eventually built at Pear Tree Bottom on the north coast, although the court delivered scathing judgments regarding the public consultation process. Now, this entire talk could be about that experience and the other lawsuits we filed. You already heard we did get a new sewage plant for Harbourview, which is now back to being poorly maintained. But here was the most important lesson for me. The law is a powerful tool, but only if you pick it up and use it. And rights can be written down on paper, but they only exist when we assert them. Filing legal action against the state is considered outrageously radical. But isn't that what the courts are for? For our best minds to deliberate on complex questions, hear arguments on both sides of any issue, mediate disputes, and make judgments about best courses of action, not to be carved in stone, but to give us guidance until new information changes those judgments. Filing an environmental case made the newspapers, of course, and this taught me about the importance of advocacy, of speaking out, of bearing witness, of being prepared to say, no, I object, you can't do that, not there. And if there is one proposal for Jet's success I will accept, it is that we did lead, did participate in, did contribute to putting the environment on the national agenda. In the early days, you could hardly get a reporter to take a call. Today, they are the ones calling. Advocacy means speaking to others, and from the very beginning I spoke. First to friends and family, yes, risking the rolled eyes, first to my own connections. Because people listen first and foremost to those they know and trust. But then I talked way outside my comfort zone. I walked around with huge photographs mounted and covered in cling film of eroded beaches, burning dumps, garbage-filled gullies. Then there were slides and a slide projector. Today, laptops and PowerPoint and drone footage easily disseminated via social media. I spoke to children in school assemblies, high-level private sector moguls in New Kingston hotels, committees of government, parliament a few times, community and student groups of all kinds. Sometimes drove 3 hours to speak with 3 people. I talked to fishermen on beaches, coal burners on the edge of forests, older people whose quality of life was diminished by commercialization in their communities, to farmers displaced by bauxite mining, ordinary people who just wanted to visit their own coastline for a sea bath, denied to them by ever-increasing walls, barriers, gates, and fences. And mostly, I felt helpless. Strangers would call and they would say, "Do something, Miss McCaulay." Once, when I outlined the long list of hurdles, a woman snapped, "What good are you then?" Feeling impotent was the heaviest of the burdens. Of course, there was criticism, often of the ad hominem variety. I was characterized as screeching, lobster-eating, Chardonnay sipping, ivory tower-dwelling member of Jamaica's elite, on a program to keep regular people out of my favorite places. I was called a racist and a terrorist. At a public meeting, a man told my husband, Fred, who's with me here too, without knowing who he was actually, that I should be tarred, feathered, and run out of town. Once at Yui, a young man said, "You say, I like you. You want to keep us living in a cave with bear, bullfrog, and peeny wally." He kissed his teeth in disgust, stood, and walked out, followed by others. The faculty member looked embarrassed. All like me? What did he mean? All environmental people? All women? All whitish women? All uptowners? I resumed my talk, but I heard the shake in my voice. Didn't Norman Manley talk about fixity of purpose? I had to dig deep to find fixity of purpose. I want to say something about the regulatory framework for environmental protection in Jamaica. The Natural Resources Conservation Authority Act was passed in 1991, the same year JET was formed, so my environmental life is roughly the same length as the life of our main law. We were excited back then at the prospect of an overarching law. Since then, however, There have been 12 environmental ministers, including 2 prime ministers, and 14 different environmental ministries. The environment has been paired with planning and production, tourism, public service, housing, land, the office of the prime minister, local government, health, water, climate change, economic growth and job creation, urban renewal, and various combinations of those things. We call the Environment Ministry the Pilgrim Ministry. There are at least 15 statutes governing the environment that are not administered by the NRCA, and at least 24 state agencies exercising environmental functions. In 2001, the NRCA was merged with the Town and Country Planning Authority and the Land Utilization Development Commission to form the National Environment and Planning Agency, which still has no governing statute. The current labyrinthine structure has the main environmental regulatory bodies reporting to the Honourable Prime Minister in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, while there is a separate environmental ministry, the Ministry of Housing, Urban Renewal, Environment and Climate Change, headed by the Honourable Pernell Charles Jr. This is not a regulatory framework which can deliver effective results. The many environmental ministers and other government officials often told me this: poverty is the main threat to the environment. It's a mantra, an article of faith that is trotted out without understanding or nuance. The belief is that only economic development can alleviate poverty. And unless that is done in pretty much the same way as it has always been done, which is to say, considering natural resources as of zero value, poor people will continue to cut down trees, burn coal, and overfish the reefs. But I say to you here, that affluence has a large or larger impact than poverty. To paraphrase a line from Stephanie Black's film Life and Death, a man with a machete cannot compete with a man with a machine, and men with machines are blazing across our country, laying it to waste. See the Portland coastline right now. Once, in a meeting about coal burning in the Portland Bight Protected Area, the then environmental minister said, the poverty is the greatest threat to the environment thing. And it was pointed out to him that coal used to come out of the area on the back of a donkey, limited in scale, in other words. And now it came out on a flatbed truck. The man burning the kiln was still poor, but those buying it for use in beach parties at North Coast hotels were not. The coal found its way to pan-chicken men, not as poor as the coal burners, but all were making a living from destroying a protected area. That coal rippled up the economic hierarchy just like pollution in a food chain. We need to understand that we live in a society, not merely an economy, and a society is about our relationships to each other and to the place in which we live. When I talk about environmental protection, I am never talking to those on the margins of survival. I am clear if I am hungry and the only thing to eat was a sea turtle, I would eat it. I am always talking to those in positions of influence, power, and leadership, those granting permits to deplete and degrade nature, the countryside, land, air, and water, when everyone, regulator, technocrat, environmental consultant, activist, advocate, investor, private sector manager, every uninterested bystander knows that the promise of monitoring and remediation will not be kept. Vision 2030 points out the problems: 94% of our forests disturbed, 20% of even forest reserves impacted by human activity, all watersheds degraded to some degree, many severely, all major rivers receiving pollutants, effluent and silt, 30% of mangroves lost to hotels, housing and roads, beach erosion, the island awash in plastic, flooding with every rain, deteriorating and highly degraded coral reefs, overfishing, rampant urbanization, poor air quality, very poor sanitation. And now we face the ravages of the climate crisis, not something we caused, but a crisis that threatens our entire civilization. Not if, but when, and soon. Yet, what are we about to do? Continue extraction by a sunset industry, bauxite, in the watershed protection area of a major river, the Rio Bueno. harming the rural lives of communities, people who grow their food and our food, treating the occupants as sacrifices for an industry that we have never, not once in 70 years, seriously evaluated its benefits and its costs. We draw a line on a map and say this is not cockpit country, so it's okay to mine it. But the people who live there say it is. And the river, which is connected to the vast aquifer that supplies us with 40% of our freshwater needs, says it is. Peter Esbute once told me, history is spatial, takes place somewhere, and here is where ours has happened. So I want to close by remembering, by honoring some of those places we've already lost, somewhere in the process of losing, and all of those still with us. Places we may yet hope to visit with our children and grandchildren. Places where our history, however tragic, unfolded. Places that ground us, tell us that we are home. Palisadoes, the Port Royal Keys, Great and Little Goat Islands, Portland Bight, the Pedro Bank, Pello Island, Blue Lagoon, the St. Thomas Morass, the Negril Morass, my hometown of Kingston, now being made over into a heat island for the motor car, the lost sand dunes and beach at Helsha, the Blue and Jonquil Mountains, the uplifted fossilized coral reef at Bengal, cockpit country, the gift of all our rivers that we channelize, pollute, sand mine, and think we can train as if they are poodles. I can't make a complete list or we'd be here all night, but I ask you, if these places, the plants and animals that live there, the shape of the land, the breezes, the smells, the sounds, the way they make us feel, if these are not worthy of our stewardship, our love, and our protection, if these are not what make us truly Jamaican, what is? Thank you.